1.2.2 Esotericism and Overcoming Dichotomous Historiographies. The separation between Constant the socialist and Eliphas Levi the occultist has its equivalent in a dichotomous separation between esotericism and the other of European intellectual history. To begin with, it is problematic that the designation esotericism is disputed within the academic study of esotericism in a manner not unlike that of the term religion within religious studies. While its etymological origins have now been relatively well clarified, there remain controversial debates over how the object of study should be theoretically conceived and methodologically investigated. The noun esoterism and its equivalents in other languages stand in a close historical relationship to occultism and, interestingly, during the first half of the 19th century, also to socialism. The term likewise appeared in French during the 19th century, although its etymological roots can be traced much further back. Its root, the Greek o-eso and later esoterikos, can demonstrably be traced back to the Platonic context of antiquity, where a distinction was made between an inner or esoteric teaching reserved for a narrow circle of students and an outer teaching intended for the public. Adjectives such as esoteric or esoteric, as well as nouns such as esotericism, esoterist, or esotericist, can be documented in the 18th century, particularly in Masonic contexts, where an esoteric distinction, modelled on ancient mystery cults and the reception of Platonism and Pythagoreanism, marked the difference between a publicly accessible doctrine and a hidden one. The noun esoterism was commonly used among French historians during the 1830s and 1840s in reference to the late antique Neoplatonic school of Alexandria. As will be shown in Chapter 3, this discourse was directly connected with contemporary writings on socialism and communism. Not only critics, but also various socialist authors employed the words esoterism or esoteric in order to situate their own ideas within a longer intellectual historical tradition. It is therefore all the more significant that the noun later became widespread primarily through the decisive influence of the writings of Eliphas Levi. On the international stage, Helena Blavatsky likewise contributed decisively to the dissemination of the English variant esotericism. Thus, much as with occultism, esotericism in its modern sense can really only be documented from the middle of the 19th century onward, even though contemporary actors commonly applied the designation retrospectively to older, sometimes imagined traditions. These assessments stand in several respects in contradiction to the bulk of previous academic scholarship on esotericism, which first took institutional form in France during the 1960s. The first academic chair in the field was established in 1965 at the Sorbonne's École pratique des hautes études under the title History of Christian Esotericism and was held by François Secret until 1979. His successor, Antoine Fèvre, who had published his study L'ésotérisme au XVIIIe siècle en France et en Allemagne in 1973, renamed the chair History of Esoteric and Mystical Currents in Modern and Contemporary Europe. In his foundational 1986 work, Accès de l'ésotérisme occidental, Fèvre developed for the first time a concrete methodology for studying esotericism. He attempted first to define esotericism through a typology as a form of thought, and second, to delimit it historically and geographically. This approach has since been criticised from many directions and has long been regarded as outdated. Nevertheless, it is worthwhile to examine its origins more closely. As the name of his academic chair already suggests, François Secret understood esotericism primarily as Christian and European, an understanding reflected in the titles mentioned above. Fèvre adopted this assessment by placing the field of esotericism within a decidedly Christian European context, and by distinguishing between a vulgar and a true esotericism, a distinction that was later critically scrutinized. The definition of true esotericism rested substantially on currents of the 18th century that had been discussed in French since the beginning of the 19th century, under the designations Illuminism, Theosophy, and Mysticism, and that experienced a revival of scholarly interest in France during the 1960s. Fèvre explicitly based his definition of esotericism on an understanding of Illuminism that he located precisely between 1770 and 1815. To this category, he assigned the great theosophers, Swedenborg, Oettinger, Eckartshausen, Martins de Pasquale, Saint-Martin, Willemos, Kirchberger, and du Toit-Membrini, Lavater, Young-Stilling, and Oberlin, who were said to be distinguished by a particular esoteric Christian spirituality and the somewhat pagan-oriented Fabre d'Olivet and Court de Gebelin. All these authors were to be understood against the background of the reception of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Pythagoreanism, initiatory secret societies, and the theosophy of Gichtel and Bohm. They were also interested in the occult sciences, alchemy, and animal magnetism. Faivre's widely received typology of true esotericism thus reflected what he himself had studied under the headings of Illuminism and theosophy in the context of the 18th century. One problem with this is that the typology emerged from a self-referential French discourse on esotericism of the late 19th and 20th centuries, in which French theosophy was constructed as the true tradition of esotericism, as will be shown in Chapter 16 concerning the rediscovery of Eliphas Levi. This circumstance is closely connected with the contemporary scholarly perspective on constant. Faivre's approach was revised by Wouter J. Hanegraaff, who in 1999 became the holder of the first chair in the History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam. The impulses emerging from Amsterdam led to an intensification of research into esotericism and to the further establishment of the field. As early as the mid-1990s, Hanegraaff had advocated an approach of empirical intellectual history in order to address the problem of ahistorical typologies that had persisted since Favre. According to this approach, a diachronic investigation of esotericism, taking all of its manifestations into account, should proceed not from the perspective of continuity, but rather from that of continual reinterpretation and reconstruction. The tracing of esoteric currents should therefore not be undertaken with the teleological aim of constructing a tradition called esotericism, but rather as a reconstruction of complex processes of absorption and reinterpretation. Hanegraaff developed this thesis in great detail and on the basis of extensive source material in his 2012 monograph, Esotericism and the Academy. He argued that esotericism should be understood as the result of a polemical process of exclusion carried out by established authorities in religion, science, and philosophy, and that this process constituted one of the most important aspects of the formation of Western identity. This process can demonstrably be traced back at least to the 17th century. Accordingly, esotericism is to be understood less as a coherent tradition than as a form of rejected knowledge, as James Webb had already argued with regard to the occult. In this interpretation, esotericism appears as the other of majority discourse, whose suppression resulted in unjustified neglect or degradation. Alternatively, Koku von Stuckrad proposed a discursive model based on the thesis of European religious pluralism developed within German religious studies. In order to overcome the limitations of Favre's approach, Stuckrad understood esotericism as a discursive field that, as part of continual processes of negotiation and transfer, had helped shape the plurality of European identities. Discursive fields change religious identities and sometimes lead to astonishing alliances and parallels between supposedly separate religious traditions. Stuckrad proposed that scholars should not speak of esotericism as though it were a coherent doctrine or tradition, but rather of the esoteric as an element within cultural processes. To identify this element, he proposed the criteria of claims to knowledge and the modes by which this knowledge is made available. In his 2010 work, Locations of Knowledge, he emphasized the polemical nature of the construction of the associated narratives of tradition. Although Stuckrad differs from Hanegraaff's grand polemical narrative on certain points, his conclusion is very similar. Over the past 2 or 3 centuries, a discursive process of distancing can be observed in which Western scholars display a dialectic of rejection and fascination toward what is today classified as esotericism. Like Hanegraaff, therefore, Stuckrad sees esotericism as the result of a process of exclusion within the contested formation of Western identity. The dichotomous historiographies resulting from the approaches of Hanegraaff and Stuckrad appear problematic in several respects. Michael Burgunder has critically observed that, through these theories of exclusion, esotericism becomes the counterpart of dominant processes of cultural self-understanding in Western cultural and religious history, thereby inscribing an essential dichotomy into that history. Such an abstract dichotomy can scarcely be meaningfully tested or operationalized historically, and risks becoming arbitrary. To Burgunder's criticism, one may add that the sharp dividing lines produced by the grand polemical narrative threaten to obscure the complexity of the overlaps and processes of exchange between the inside and the excluded. Even though both Hanegraaff and Stuckrad emphasize and portray the dynamism and complexity involved in constructing the other, their theories of the rejection, discarding, or even prohibition of particular forms of knowledge ultimately amount only to shifting the positions within a dichotomy. This ambiguity is intensified by the fact that source material is treated at the macro level of European identity formation and is rarely contextualized en detail. Thus, although one of the principal aims of esotericism scholarship is to demonstrate the cultural relevance of esotericism, it paradoxically often reproduces precisely the dichotomies of those polemics that had long obscured that relevance. Constant's development makes it especially clear that the dichotomization of esotericism and its other results in the separation of historical contexts that were originally intertwined. The history of esotericism is indeed marked by polemics and processes of exclusion, but it appears problematic for scholarship simply to perpetuate these exclusions and demarcations de facto rather than critically questioning them. This has serious consequences not only for the academic study of esotericism, but also for history and religious studies more generally. Isolating esotericism, or isolating a particular historical actor such as Constant, simply cannot adequately represent the complexity of historical developments. For this reason, the present study advocates a genealogical approach, which will be explained theoretically below. This approach presupposes the consistent historical contextualization of boundary making, not only between esotericism, occultism, and the other, but also between religion, science, and politics. Furthermore, historiographical exclusions and overlaps must be critically examined, since they are of immediate relevance to this study, not only with regard to occultism, but also to the various socialisms before 1848.